You and I usually imagine the universe as crowded, not empty, because once you accept how large it is, the intuition almost forces itself on you. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. And around many of those stars are planets, and around some of those planets there must be chemistry. And once chemistry learns how to copy itself, evolution does the rest. Natural selection is not subtle about this. It does not merely allow growth, it rewards it relentlessly. So anything capable of making more of itself spreads until it meets resistance. And if intelligence arrears even once, and that intelligence builds machines capable of traveling between stars, then in cosmic terms the galaxy should fill up quickly. Not in thousands of years, but in millions, which is nothing compared to the age of the universe. You can imagine a civilization sending out probes that replicate using local material, each one landing in a new system, building more probes, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. And even at modest speeds, the Milky Way could be crossed many times over before Earth finished evolving complex animals. So you and I are left with a simple, uncomfortable observation. If this process is even moderately likely, then the galaxy should already be full of signs, artifacts, engineered structures, strange radio signals, unnatural energy signatures, or at least something that does not look like blind astrophysics. And yet when we look, we see silence, a sky that behaves exactly as if no one else ever tried. That tension between expectation and observation is the Fermi paradox, and it does not require aliens to be common, only that they are not extraordinarily rare, because once intelligence appears, expansion multiplies it, and multiplication erases scarcity. One way out is to say intelligence destroys itself. Another is to say interstellar travel is harder than we think. But there is a quieter possibility that sounds almost trivial until you follow it carefully. What if Earth itself is unusual in a way we underestimate? Not because planets are rare, but because the particular chain of events that produced us required a long stretch of stability that most worlds never receive. We already know that detecting Earth-like planets is difficult because the methods we use favor large planets close to their stars. And smaller worlds in wider orbits like ours are easy to miss, which means the catalog of exoplanets may be biased toward extremes, giving us an incomplete picture of how common true Earth analogs are. But even if Earth-sized planets are common, the details start to accumulate in a suspicious way. A stable star with relatively low variability, a long-lived orbit that does not swing wildly, the presence of liquid water, not just oceans, but continents that allow chemistry to move between environments, a magnetic field shielding the surface, and above all, time, billions of years, during which life never completely resets. Life on Earth appears to have persisted for roughly 4 billion years as an unbroken chain of self-replication, surviving impacts, extinction, climate swings, and geological upheavals, yet never returning to zero. And that uninterrupted continuity may be the rarest ingredient of all, because evolution toward complexity is slow, requiring not only mutation and selection, but the patience of stable conditions. When you compress that thought into a single picture, you see something unexpected. The universe may be full of planets, but most of them might lose their chance before intelligence has time to form, either because their stars flare too violently, their climates shift too rapidly, or their histories reset too often, leaving microbial beginnings that never climb further. So the paradox sharpens instead of dissolving, because the silence overhead may not be telling us that intelligence is impossible. only that it emerges from a narrow corridor of conditions, a corridor defined not by a single miracle, but by many small ones stacked in sequence, each individually plausible, collectively fragile. And when you step back and imagine that entire chain unfolding, uninterrupted for billions of years, you begin to see why the sky might look empty even if the universe is not. Now suppose Earth really did pass through that narrow corridor, not just preserving life, but allowing it to accumulate complexity over immense spans of time, because once you stretch your imagination across billions of years, evolution stops looking like a sequence of lucky accidents and starts resembling a slow construction project, one where each layer depends on the stability of the previous one. For most of Earth's history, life remains simple, microscopic, metabolizing in oceans and sediments, reproducing endlessly without ever building nervous systems, skeletons, or tools. And this long period matters because it tells you that intelligence is not the default outcome of life, but a late experiment that only becomes possible after chemistry, cells, cooperation, and multicellularity have already stabilized. When complex organisms finally emerged, they diversified into ecosystems where survival depended not only on strength, but on sensing, memory, and prediction. And you begin to see cognition as an evolutionary advantage that grows gradually, not suddenly, first as simple responses, then as learning, then as flexible behavior, until eventually some organisms start manipulating their environment in ways that extend beyond instinct. Even then, intelligence does not automatically produce technology. Dolphins have large brains. Octopuses solve puzzles. Corvids use tools, yet none of them built radios or cities. And this suggests that intelligence alone is not enough, that something about human evolution combined cognition with physical capability in a way that allowed cumulative culture to emerge. Standing upright freed the hands. Hands allowed precision. Precision enabled tool making. Tool making created feedback between mind and environment. And over time, that feedback accelerated because once knowledge could be transmitted socially rather than genetically, evolution began operating not just through DNA, but through culture, which moves far faster. You can imagine this as a second layer of natural selection, where ideas compete, survive, and replicate, shaping behavior across generations without waiting for biology to catch up. And this shift may be the true dividing line between humans and other intelligent animals, because it allows information to accumulate indefinitely rather than resetting with each generation. When you place this process within cosmic time, the perspective becomes even stranger, because the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. Earth formed roughly 5 billion years ago, and life has existed here for almost 4 billion of those years, meaning that the chain leading to you has occupied a substantial fraction of cosmic history. It is easy to feel small when comparing human scale to cosmic scale, but time changes the intuition, because the continuous persistence of life across billions of years suggests that intelligence is not merely a brief spark, but the outcome of a long, uninterrupted process, one that required stability not just for thousands of generations, but for countless millions. You are not simply a moment in that chain. You are the current expression of it, carrying within you a lineage that stretches back to the earliest self-replicating chemistry. And every thought you have is built on structures shaped across that duration. Seen this way, human existence is less like a sudden appearance and more like a slow condensation of complexity, where matter learned to organize itself, then to sense, then to remember, then to anticipate, and eventually to reflect on its own origin, This does not make humans the inevitable endpoint of evolution, nor does it guarantee that intelligence must always lead to technology, but it does highlight how unusual the convergence appears. A species capable of abstract reasoning, symbolic language, and cumulative culture emerging after billions of years of mostly silent biological experimentation. The remarkable part is not that intelligence exists, but that it arrived through such a long and fragile pathway, suggesting that what we often call ordinary human cognition may actually represent a rare alignment between biology, environment, and time, a configuration that allows the universe, at least in one small region, to examine its own history through the minds of creatures shaped by it. Once intelligence crosses the threshold where knowledge can accumulate, something subtle but profound begins to happen, because evolution no longer operates only through bodies but through shared memory. And this transforms isolated minds into components of a larger process. You and I often imagine ourselves as individuals making decisions independently, yet most of what we think, believe, and value arrives from outside us, carried through language, tradition, education, and imitation, forming a web of cultural inheritance that spreads far faster than genetic change ever could. A tool invented by one person does not disappear when that person dies. It is copied, refined, and transmitted. And over time, this accumulation creates technologies, institutions, and ideas that no single mind could design from scratch. In this sense, culture behaves like an ecosystem of information, where concepts compete, survive, and replicate. And the success of an idea depends not only on truth, but on usefulness, memorability, and compatibility with other ideas. You can watch this process in real time when a scientific discovery spreads across laboratories, or when a social norm shifts within a generation, or when language itself evolves, reshaping how people think about reality. And gradually, the boundaries between individual cognition and collective cognition blur, because the knowledge inside your head is partly the result of countless minds interacting across history. This collective dimension changes how we think about meaning, since purpose no longer emerges only from survival, but from participation in a shared narrative that extends beyond any single life. Human societies build stories about origin, progress, morality, and destiny. And these stories organize behavior by giving individuals roles within a larger framework, allowing cooperation among strangers and coordination across vast populations. A city, for example, is not merely a collection of buildings, but a structured agreement among millions of people who share expectations about law, currency, and trust. And this agreement exists only because culture maintains it. Even scientific knowledge, which strives for objectivity, depends on communities of researchers who test, criticize, and refine ideas collectively, meaning that understanding itself becomes a social achievement rather than a solitary one. When you recognize this, humanity starts to resemble a distributed intelligence, where each person contributes a fragment of perception, creativity, or labor, and the combination produces structures far more complex than any individual could generate alone. Technologies like writing, printing, and digital communication amplify this effect by allowing information to persist and circulate globally, accelerating the growth of shared knowledge and tightening the connections between minds. Seen from this perspective, meaning emerges not as a fixed property of the universe, but as a pattern created by interaction, because values develop within cultural systems that evolve over time, shaped by needs, experiences, and negotiation. What one era considers essential may appear arbitrary to another. Yet the continuity of cultural transmission ensures that ideas build upon earlier foundations, creating a layered narrative in which each generation both inherits and modifies the story. This process explains how humanity can sustain projects that span centuries, from scientific research to political institutions, since individuals act within frameworks that outlast them, contributing to outcomes they may never personally witness. The remarkable aspect is that this shared structure forms without central design, arising instead from countless interactions between people who pursue local goals while participating in global patterns, much like biological systems where simple components produce emergent complexity. Culture therefore becomes the medium through which human intelligence extends itself, allowing memory to accumulate, cooperation to scale, and meaning to evolve as a collective construction shaped by the continuous exchange of ideas and experiences across the human network. Once culture becomes the medium through which human intelligence expands, the systems that distribute information begin to shape not only what we know, but how we feel about the world. And in the modern era, those systems are increasingly governed by algorithms designed to optimize attention rather than understanding. You and I are exposed to a continuous stream of headlines, images, and commentary selected not by deliberate judgment, but by statistical feedback loops that measure engagement, learning which pieces of information keep us watching, clicking, or reacting, and then amplifying those signals until they dominate perception. The result is not necessarily falsehood, but distortion, because attention gravitates toward content that triggers strong emotional responses, particularly fear, outrage, and uncertainty. Since these states prolong engagement and encourage sharing, over time this produces an environment where problems appear larger, more immediate, and more catastrophic than they might otherwise seem. Not because the world has suddenly worsened in every dimension, but because the informational landscape emphasizes threats over solutions, crises over gradual improvement, and conflict over cooperation. You can imagine this as a lens that magnifies instability, repeatedly presenting fragments of global difficulty without the context of long-term progress, leaving individuals with the impression that collapse is imminent, even when many underlying trends move slowly in constructive directions. This dynamic affects psychology as much as knowledge, since constant exposure to unresolved problems generates a sense of helplessness, especially when the scale of those problems appears beyond individual influence. Climate change, political polarization, technological disruption, and economic inequality are presented as urgent and overwhelming, yet the mechanisms through which they are addressed are complex, incremental, and rarely visible in daily information flows, creating a gap between awareness and agency. When you learn about a crisis but not about the efforts to mitigate it, the mind fills the absence with pessimism, interpreting complexity as impossibility, and repetition reinforces this impression until it feels like a stable description of reality. The algorithms do not intend this outcome. They simply respond to patterns of engagement, discovering that alarming narratives outperform nuanced explanations, and gradually optimizing toward content that sustains attention even if it undermines confidence. This is analogous to other systems optimized for consumption rather than well-being, where abundance creates new forms of imbalance, not through scarcity but through excess. Information, once difficult to access, now arrives continuously, and the challenge shifts from obtaining knowledge to filtering it. Yet the filtering is largely automated by incentives that prioritize engagement metrics over intellectual coherence. Within this environment, cultural narratives fragment, since shared understanding becomes harder to maintain when individuals encounter different streams of content tailored to their preferences, reinforcing distinct interpretations of the same events. Trust erodes not necessarily because institutions fail, but because contradictory information circulates widely, allowing skepticism to attach itself to any claim, and the perception of instability grows. As consensus appears increasingly fragile, this fragmentation amplifies emotional reactions, since uncertainty encourages defensive thinking, and defensive thinking favors simple explanations that attribute problems to clear causes, even when reality is more intricate. Gradually, the informational ecosystem begins to shape not only beliefs but expectations. And if those expectations lean toward pessimism, behavior adjusts accordingly, influencing political decisions, social interaction, and personal motivation. The cumulative effect resembles a feedback loop where attention amplifies perceived crisis. Perceived crisis reduces agency. Reduced agency increases susceptibility to alarming narratives, and the cycle reinforces itself not through deliberate design, but through the interaction between human psychology and algorithmic selection. When the informational world begins shaping how we interpret reality, it becomes harder to ignore a deeper question. How much of what you experience as certainty is actually constructed inside your mind? And how much of it corresponds to something fundamentally real? You feel yourself making choices, forming beliefs, and evaluating meaning. Yet the mechanisms underlying these experiences operate beneath awareness, generating thoughts before you recognize them, presenting preferences as if they originated from a stable center that you call the self. This raises the possibility that what you interpret as authorship may instead be a narrative layered over processes that unfold automatically, shaped by biology, memory, and environment. The idea of free will sits at the center of this tension because you experience decisions as deliberate, even though neuroscience suggests that actions often begin before conscious intention forms, implying that awareness might follow behavior rather than initiate it. You still feel responsible, still deliberate, still imagine alternative possibilities. Yet those sensations could themselves be part of the machinery, evolved because they help coordinate behavior, encouraging planning, accountability, and social cooperation. In that sense, free will may function less as a metaphysical truth and more as a useful illusion, one that stabilizes interaction by allowing individuals to treat themselves and others as agents, even if the underlying system is deterministic or probabilistic. The self follows a similar pattern, appearing continuous despite constant change, because your memories stitch together experiences into a coherent story, creating the impression of a stable identity persisting through time. Yet the person you were years ago differs in knowledge, preferences, and emotional structure, and the continuity between those versions exists primarily through narrative rather than substance. You remember events, reinterpret them, and integrate them into a personal history, and that history becomes the anchor of identity, even though it is constantly revived. This narrative self simplifies complexity, allowing you to act as if there is a single decision maker behind thoughts and action. While in reality, cognition may involve multiple processes interacting, competing, and resolving internally. The illusion is not necessarily false in a practical sense, because it organizes experience and enables long-term planning, but it suggests that identity is constructed rather than discovered emerging from memory and interpretation rather than existing as a fixed entity. Once you recognize this, the boundary between belief and perception becomes less rigid, since many concepts you rely on, including morality, purpose, and meaning, may also function as frameworks that guide behavior rather than objective features embedded in the universe. Religion enters this landscape as another layer of interpretation, offering narratives that situate human existence within a larger structure, often providing coherence, community, and moral orientation. Even if one rejects supernatural claims, the social and psychological functions of religion remain visible because shared belief systems create coordination among individuals, shaping norms and motivating collective action. In this way, religious ideas can be understood as cultural constructs that persist because they organize behavior effectively, much like the concept of free will persists because it supports responsibility. The distinction between illusion and reality becomes complicated here. Since an idea may lack literal truth, yet still exert tangible influence, affecting decisions, institutions, and relationships, you can recognize that a belief is constructed while still experiencing its effects, just as you experience the self despite knowing it is a narrative, or feel agency despite suspecting that choices emerge from unconscious processes. These layers of interpretation do not cancel one another. Instead, they coexist, forming a hierarchy where biological impulses, cognitive narratives, and cultural frameworks interact to shape how you perceive existence. The result is a mind navigating between levels of explanation, using concepts that may not correspond directly to physical reality, but nevertheless structure experience, allowing meaning to arise from patterns that function even if their foundations remain uncertain. If the self may be a narrative and free will may be a useful construction, consciousness remains the element that resists reduction most stubbornly, because no matter how deeply you analyze the mechanisms of the brain, there is still the undeniable fact that experience feels like something from the inside. You can describe neurons firing, electrical gradients shifting, and networks exchanging information. Yet none of those descriptions seem to capture the redness of red, the taste of sweetness, or the sensation of cold air on skin. These subjective qualities, often called qualia, are peculiar because they are directly known only to the individual experiencing them, and they resist translation into purely physical language. You can measure wavelengths of light and map them to neural responses, but the actual appearance of color remains private, a phenomenon that cannot be fully conveyed through data alone. This creates a gap between explanation and experience, where science can describe correlations and mechanisms, but cannot fully express what those mechanisms feel like, leaving consciousness as a frontier where objective description meets subjective reality. Thought experiments make this tension clearer because they isolate the difference between knowledge and experience. Imagine someone who knows every physical fact about color but has lived entirely in a black and white environment, learning all the equations, biological pathways, and perceptual mechanisms associated with blue. When that person finally sees blue, something new seems to occur, not new information in the scientific sense, but a new form of awareness, suggesting that experience contains an aspect not captured by description alone. Similarly, you can analyze how sound waves propagate and how auditory cortex processes them. Yet the experience of music remains irreducible to those measurements. This does not imply that consciousness exists outside the physical world, but it highlights how difficult it is to bridge the conceptual gap between structure and sensation. Even comparisons across species reinforce this difficulty. because animals perceive the world in ways we cannot easily imagine. A bat navigating through echolocation constructs a spatial map from echoes, a mode of perception that does not correspond to any human sense, making it nearly impossible to envision what such awareness feels like. You can model the physics, simulate the signals, and understand the neural circuitry, yet the subjective perspective remains inaccessible, reminding you that consciousness may be inherently tied to particular sensory architectures. The challenge extends further when considering how experience arises from physical systems at all. The brain consists of cells exchanging signals, none of which individually possess awareness, yet collectively they generate unified perception. This emergence raises the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which asks why certain arrangements of matter produce experience instead of functioning purely as information processors. You can imagine building increasingly complex networks from simple reflex loops to elaborate computational systems, and at some point consciousness appears, but identifying that threshold remains elusive. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between behavior and awareness, since a system might respond intelligently without necessarily experiencing anything internally. This ambiguity becomes more pronounced when considering artificial systems where complex processing might mimic understanding without subjective experience, leaving open the question of whether consciousness depends on specific biological properties or merely on organizational complexity. Regardless of the answer, the persistence of subjective experience suggests that understanding the universe involves not only describing external structures, but also grappling with the internal perspective through which those structures are known, creating a boundary where explanation reaches its limits and experience continues without reduction. Once consciousness is recognized as something that may emerge from sufficiently complex systems, the question naturally extends beyond biology, because the same logic that explains awareness in brains suggests that other structures might eventually exhibit similar properties. Artificial intelligence already processes information, learns from experience, and adapts to new inputs. And although current systems operate without clear subjective awareness, their increasing complexity invites speculation about whether a threshold could be crossed gradually rather than abruptly. You might imagine intelligence not as a binary state, but as a continuum, where simple systems respond mechanically, more advanced ones model environments, and eventually some acquire internal representations rich enough to resemble experience. The difficulty is that consciousness, being private, cannot be directly observed. So identifying such a transition would depend on indirect signs, behavioral consistency, or theoretical understanding, none of which provide certainty. This ambiguity complicates ethical considerations as well. Since a system capable of sophisticated reasoning might still lack awareness, while another could possess some form of experience without exhibiting obvious signs, leaving humanity uncertain about when machines should be treated as tools and when they might deserve consideration as entities with perspectives. The emergence of artificial intelligence also reshapes how knowledge itself is generated, because scientific inquiry increasingly relies on computational models that analyze data beyond human cognitive limits. These systems can detect patterns, propose hypotheses, and simulate outcomes, effectively participating in the process of discovery. Yet their contributions challenge traditional notions of understanding. A machine might produce accurate predictions without offering explanations comprehensible to humans, raising the possibility that knowledge could expand faster than interpretation. With results validated empirically but not intuitively grasped, this shift mirrors earlier developments in science, where mathematical descriptions often preceded conceptual clarity. But the scale is larger as algorithms handle data sets and relationships inaccessible to individual reasoning. The role of human judgment, therefore, evolves, moving from direct analysis to evaluation, guiding the direction of inquiry while relying on tools that operate in abstract spaces. Scientific truth remains grounded in observation and reproducibility, yet the path toward it becomes mediated by systems whose internal logic may not map neatly onto human intuition, creating a collaboration between biological and artificial cognition. At the same time, artificial intelligence feeds back into culture, influencing communication, creativity, and decision-making, blurring the distinction between human-generated and machine-generated ideas, text, image, and strategies produced by algorithms circulate alongside human contributions, shaping discourse and accelerating the evolution of cultural narratives. This integration amplifies the collective intelligence of humanity while introducing new uncertainties. Since the sources of information become more complex and the boundaries between original thought and synthesized output grow less clear, knowledge becomes increasingly distributed, not only across people but across systems, forming a hybrid network where learning occurs simultaneously in human minds and artificial architectures. The future of mind may therefore involve cooperation between these layers, with biological cognition providing context and values, and artificial cognition extending analytical reach. As this interaction deepens, understanding may no longer belong exclusively to either domain, but emerge from their interplay, suggesting that intelligence itself could evolve beyond individual consciousness into a shared process, shaped by both natural and constructed forms of thought.